Hi everyone, this is week 5 video 2. In video 1 we just went through a plausible interpretation of Wittgenstein's conclusion at 4.12 that propositions cannot represent logical forms. Because there's no such things as logical forms, to suppose that there are such things is to misunderstand what logical forms are. And obviously everything I'm saying now is kind of paradoxical because I'm acting both like there are such things as logical forms and that there aren't such things as logical forms. But shelve that worry, we'll get to that in video 3. The point is, Wittgenstein says that some things the propositions can't represent, namely possibilities of structure. So what sort of ramifications can be drawn from this conclusion? Well, in Wittgenstein's view, plenty. So very many classical philosophical problems involve, according to Wittgenstein, a very similar error to the error you commit when you suppose that there are objects such as logical forms. So remember, logical forms are possibilities. Possibilities themselves aren't capable of being represented in any way because there are no such things as possibilities. Well, the word possibility is a piece of so-called modal vocabulary. Modal notions include notions to do with possibility and necessity. And it's an upshot of 4.12 that Wittgenstein thinks that there are no propositions which make sense, which employ modal notions. So for any proposition of the form, the possibility that X is Y, no proposition of that form makes sense, because what you're attempting to do when you articulate a proposition like that is to discuss something which isn't there to be discussed. You're attempting to treat possibilities as objects, and they're not. So what does this mean for philosophy? Well, just think of some of the most sort of classical philosophical problems that have occurred since antiquity, through early modern philosophy. Stuff like, is knowledge possible? Potentially the most well-worn philosophical problem around, the problem of epistemology, the problem from which skepticism arises. Let's look at another classical problem. Is it possible for there to be a being that's both omnipotent and omnibenevolent, and for evil to exist in the world? Is that a possibility? That's the classical problem of evil in the philosophy of religion. There's two. I'm not going to list all the classical problems of philosophy, but there's two very, very sort of serious ones, and both of them employ modal notions. Now, to cut a long story very short, I think that Wittgenstein thinks that the employment of modal notions always issues in nonsense. Because to treat possibilities as things is to misunderstand what possibilities are. Possibilities aren't things. Possibilities are potential structures, and the potential of those structures is wholly dependent on the characteristics of the constituents forming those structures. So Wittgenstein thinks that any proposition employing a modal notion is nonsense. It's misunderstanding what possibilities are. We've just seen how that follows from Wittgenstein's investigation into the notion of logical form. Logical forms are possibilities, they're certainly not things. Possibilities aren't themselves things, they're not objects, they can't be named and represented. So Wittgenstein in fact thinks that all of the classical philosophical problems are, articulations of those problems express nothing. They are nonsensical strings of gibberish because nothing answers to the words that we use when we try to articulate those problems. That's what Wittgenstein thinks. Now, he doesn't go through every single classical philosophical problem and show quite how this works for every single problem. He thinks he's done enough to persuade his reader that every philosophical problem is nonsense. But he doesn't go through every single philosophical problem and prove it by saying, look, here's an expression of this philosophical problem, here's the bit of language you've used incorrectly, and that's why it's nonsense. He doesn't do that for every single philosophical problem. This is characteristic of the Tractatus, takes place at quite a high level of abstraction. He's interested in grand claims, all-encompassing fell swoops, not he doesn't go in and do what I think in his view would be sort of grunt work, which is going through every single philosophical problem and exposing the reason for its being nonsensical. But Wittgenstein does ask us to reconceive of philosophy as an activity of precisely that kind. So Wittgenstein thinks that since all the philosophical problems are nonsense, philosophy isn't a kind of body of knowledge. We don't gain knowledge when we do philosophy. We don't sort of, if I pose to you the problem, is knowledge possible? We think about it for a million years. Eventually someone decides, yes, it is. And according to the sort of traditional view of philosophy, what we will have gained is itself a piece of knowledge. We'll have gained knowledge of the fact that we can have knowledge. This statement, knowledge is possible, we tick that off, put it in the philosophical catalogue and go, right, we've got that nailed down. Wittgenstein says that's the wrong way to think about philosophy. We shouldn't be thinking about philosophy in that way. Rather, we should reconceive of philosophy as an activity rather than a kind of body of knowledge, a list of true statements that we've arrived at after thinking really hard. He thinks that's not what philosophy ought to be conceived of as being. So according to Wittgenstein's sort of new program, when you do philosophy, what you really should be doing is just clarifying your expressions and discovering precisely why philosophical problems are nonsensical. So the day-to-day task of the sort of grunt philosopher will be precisely to go through those philosophical problems that Wittgenstein hasn't gone through, and to carefully look at the use of language there, and to identify the errors in the use of language there, and to expose the fact that the problem in question, or articulation of the problem in question, is a specimen of nonsense. This is how Wittgenstein asks us to reconceive of philosophy. Because he thinks these problems are nonsense, it won't do to keep hammering at them and trying to get truths out of them. We have to turn our attention to a clarification of what they mean. And when we do that sufficiently rigorously, we'll discover that they don't mean anything. It's no surprise, therefore, that philosophers haven't come to an agreement on most of these classical problems. There's nothing to agree about. Expressions of classical philosophical problems are nonsense. Metaphysics is nonsense. Wittgenstein also thinks ethics and aesthetics, those entire subfields or fields, are basically just littered with nonsense expressions. So that's sort of big. That's Wittgenstein's conclusion. That's why the Tractatus is very notorious. That's one reason why it's very notorious. It influenced logical empiricists, positivists, who obviously took this and ran with it. And that's Wittgenstein's view. Now, we've just said that in Wittgenstein's view, we can't represent possibilities and meaningfully sort of discuss them as though they were things. We can't name logical forms and discuss them as though they were things. That's a misunderstanding of what logical form is, of what possibility is. So we can't say anything about such things because there's no such things about which to say anything. Wittgenstein then draws a very interesting distinction in the Tractatus between saying and showing. So he thinks that we can't say of a possibility that it is such and such a character, because there's no such thing as that possibility to refer to and subsequently to discuss. So we can't say anything about possibilities. Even that sentence implies that there are such things as possibilities when there aren't. Nonetheless, Wittgenstein does think that something about possibility can be shown in propositions, even if nothing can be said about such things, because there aren't such things. Take, for instance, our familiar proposition by now: the cat is on the mat. What does that proposition represent? It represents a state of affairs of a cat being on a mat. Well, Wittgenstein thinks this proposition doesn't purport to say anything about a possibility. No, it purports to say something about a cat and a mat. But it nonetheless shows us something about possibility. It shows us that what it represents is possible. It shows us that the state of affairs it represents is possible because it makes sense. And if the proposition makes sense, what it represents has got to be a live possibility. So although the proposition doesn't say anything about possibility, it doesn't purport to name a possibility and discuss it, it purports to name a cat and discuss the cat, it nonetheless reveals to us, it shows to us something about possibility. It shows to us, in virtue of its making sense at all, that the state of affairs it represents is a possibility. So we can glean modal knowledge from propositions. Propositions can reveal to us modal information about possibilities without their attempting to name possibilities and say things about them. This is Wittgenstein's view. And in fact, he thinks there's an awful lot of stuff is shown rather than said. And he says very famously, what can be shown cannot be said. What else does Wittgenstein think the propositions show? Well, things like this. If we've got a proposition that says Ollie is speaking, that proposition, if it makes sense, represents me as speaking, but it also shows or reveals to us in a way other than saying that there is such a thing as Ollie. If that proposition makes sense, we know, or we can understand, or we can gather that the elements of the proposition stand for things which exist. Now, we did say last week that things like me, like Ollie, don't count as objects according to the Tractatus. So when you actually carry out the analysis of language, the elementary propositions won't be like Ollie is talking. But we don't have any examples of genuine objects. We've just got to assume for some of these examples that I am an object. If you have a proposition that makes sense, it shows you that the thing it represents is possible, and it also shows you that the things that the names refer to exist. It shows you also that they have the combinatorial potential that they do. And there's other examples of things which Wittgenstein thinks can be shown but not said. Maybe we'll get into that in the in-person sessions. But this is an important distinction between things that can be explicitly discussed as the subject matter of a proposition and things that are shown to us by propositions, but which can't themselves be put into words, Wittgenstein thinks. He says that these things which are shown but not said constitute that which is mystical. These sorts of remarks about mysticism come towards the end of the Tractatus, and they're quite difficult to understand. A subject of great controversy in the scholarship, but for our purposes, it's enough to note this distinction between saying and showing and see that Wittgenstein seems to observe that distinction. I think that's enough for this video. In the third and final video, we'll get to the paradox of the Tractatus. Thanks, everyone.